Hi, my name is Thais Gibson, and I'm the creator of the Personal Development School. Welcome to this channel. So I just want to start by saying thank you so much for stopping by. Thank you for being here. If you are new to this channel, this essentially is an entire channel all about personal development, but specifically for the subconscious mind, because this is where real change happens. Research shows conclusively that the subconscious mind will always overpower the conscious mind. And so, what we really have to be able to do when we want to create change is learn ways to specifically target the subconscious mind, learn how to sort of hack the system in a way so that we can reprogram it so that change can exist there, which makes change possible for the long run instead of feeling like we're in this kind of push pull, like you're driving a car and you've got the gas on and the brakes on at the same time. Now, what you'll see a lot on this channel is that there is a really dominant focus on attachment styles and on relationships. And this is because relationships essentially touch every other area of our lives. They affect how we have communication and conversations in the workplace. They affect our different interactions with romantic relationships, which have a huge impact on family and communication and our sense of happiness and well-being, as well as just family relationships in general and friendships. So, what you'll see if you're not already familiar is we tend to talk quite a bit about attachment theory. There's a variety of other topics on here for sure, and so much more content that this channel has, but this tends to be a place that we sort of navigate into. And our attachment style you can think of as sort of being the subconscious set of rules that you learn to relate to other people. And we tend to adopt these rules early on in childhood. Now, the subconscious mind gets programmed in three major ways: through what we see repetitively or what's modeled to us, what we hear repetitively. So, for example, if you always grow up in a family that says, we're running out of money, there's not enough, that's likely to create a program in you at the subconscious level that probably has some lack beliefs. And then also whatever we have firsthand experiences of. And so because our early childhood tends to shape so many of these things, and also because in the first 8 or so years of life, we are sort of the most suggestible. We're like gathering and sponging in the most information and sort of adopting many of the rules that we tend to sort of live by going forward in the future. What you'll see is that our attachment style developed during that period of time, and especially in the earlier years, has a massive impact on the way we live our lives, the way we feel, the way we communicate, our expectations, our needs as people, our core wounds, our fears, all these different dynamics. So if you're not already familiar, there are four main attachment styles. The first attachment style is the securely attached individual. Now, this is somebody who grows up in a household where there tends to be a lot of congruency, consistency, trust, safety, connection, communication, negotiation of needs. And so a child basically learns to grow up thinking that I'm safe in the world. I deserve to feel seen and heard. And when I express, my caregivers care for me and they show up for me. So it's safe to feel my emotions. It's safe to express my emotions. And naturally, as a byproduct of all of that, this individual is going to feel more trusting in relationships, more open to relationships. They're probably going to be a better communicator because they had their needs met and seen and understood and sort of validated at a young age. And so they believe in their own needs, their own ability or power to communicate their needs and boundaries, as well as believing in that for other people. And so this is sort of where we're trying to get to if we're not already securely attached. Now, we then have our three insecurely attached styles. And these are dismissive avoidant, anxious preoccupied, and fearful avoidant. Now, you may look at somebody who's dismissive avoidant and recognize them in some of these qualities. Somebody who is afraid of commitment, somebody who's a little slow to warm up, who's quite guarded, who's a little bit disconnected from their own emotions, who's somebody who doesn't really like to share their inner reality with other people and can be very sensitive to criticism at times. Now, we might know somebody like this, we might have a friend like this, we might have dated somebody like this, but it's really important to recognize that a lot of this comes from a form of emotional neglect in childhood. So usually this person grows up in a childhood where their emotions are not really made space for. And there can be like overt neglect, like really intense neglect that occurs, and then we'll see more intensely dismissive avoidantly attached people. But this can also be something that kind of flies under the radar, where like all the needs are met at a baseline. However, the deep, like interpersonal emotional needs are not being met. So there isn't attunement from a caregiver. There isn't space made to talk about emotions. Maybe emotions are shamed a little bit. Like if you're crying, you're a crybaby, or oh, nobody wants to hear you cry, or there's a dismissal of emotions to a certain degree. And what ends up happening is this individual grows up to fear their own emotions. And they grow up to think, oh, there must be something wrong with me, that a part of me wasn't accepted. And so they often have a core belief that they're defective. They often have a core belief that they're unsafe to trust people, rely on other people, to be vulnerable, because vulnerability is weakness, is a big belief. And they often feel trapped really easily in commitment because they don't feel comfortable relying on people. And so a relationship seems like a binding thing that's outside of their comfort zone. So you may understand a little bit about where that might come from. And it's important that if you're the partner of a dismissive avoidant, that you learn the appropriate tools to show up for yourself, for your own needs, and to also decipher if you're with any insecurely attached style, if that's the right relationship for you or not. Because sometimes, difference of attachment styles is a healthy thing, and other times it can be a really painful thing. And that's really going to depend on the other person if they're willing to do the work. So that applies to all insecurely attached styles. And our next style is anxious preoccupied. And you can think of that as sort of being at the other end of the continuum, the opposite of the dismissive avoidant. The anxious preoccupied individual, they tend to have a huge abandonment fear. So they fear being disconnected, being abandoned, being rejected, being not good enough. And they tend to really derive a lot of their sense of self and their needs being met through their relationships to other people. They often have a lot of codependent tendencies as well. And you'll see that a lot of this attachment style tends to come from a childhood and a family where there's a lot of real or perceived abandonment over time. And yet there's a lot of positive emotional associations built into connection. So for example, you might have a really connected, attuned parents, but they work a lot. So there's like a lot of this juxtaposition of care, kindness, showing up, attunement, and then that being taken away. You could also have one caregiver who's like really warm, really there and available, and another who's not. And so this juxtaposition creates this internal fear of like, you give me love and then it's taken. And it creates this huge abandonment fear and wound and fear of being alone. And it forces the anxious preoccupied individual as an adaptation or a survival strategy to hyper focus in on getting their needs met from others and changing themselves to be whatever they need to be, more charming, more charismatic, more lovable, more interesting, always focusing on trying to get their needs met from other people by becoming that way. But it's sort of with that comes this inherent self-abandonment that quietly takes place beneath the surface because they're not showing up for themselves and their needs. They're contorting their needs and themselves to become what makes them interesting to others so that they can then get their needs met by others. And so they sort of disconnect from the relationship to themselves as a strategy to get their needs met. And long term, this creates this kind of vicious cycle where this person desperately fears abandonment. And we'll see these individuals often feeling not good enough, afraid of rejection, very sensitive to being excluded or disliked, feeling very, very afraid of being alone or abandoned, being really critical of themselves and really sad if they feel like somebody's disconnecting in a relationship. And so we'll see these individuals grow up, and they may be somebody who constantly goes from one relationship to another. They may be somebody who is very sensitive and in pain a lot in relationships and closeness because they're constantly unable to settle in and trust that somebody isn't going to leave them. And you may see as well that they have dynamics where they will call repetitively, will accidentally disrespect somebody else's boundaries and needs for space because they're really trying to enmesh and get as close as possible at all times. And they're constantly hungering for more emotional closeness. Now, we then have our last major attachment style, and this is the fearful avoidant attachment style. And sometimes they're referred to as the disorganized attachment style or anxious avoidant attachment style. And the fearful avoidant, they basically sort of are in a way in the middle of the continuum because they have the anxious side to them and the dismissive side. Now, this individual usually grows up in a household where they're exposed to a lot of distrust, a lot of chaos, and to a certain degree, generally more severe trauma than other attachment styles. And you can imagine that this could be because of a lot of fighting in the household, a lot of like parental alienation where one parent turns the child against another, alcoholism, drug abuse, any sorts of traumas along those lines, all the way extending to more, even more severe traumas like sexual abuse and so on. And essentially, these different forms of experiences teach a child that I can't predict how my caregivers are going to react or behave. And I can't really trust their behavior to be consistent and something that makes me feel safe. And so, what often will take place is a child always trying to kind of read between the lines. And you can imagine, for example, if there was an alcoholic parent, okay? Let's pretend the mother of this child is an alcoholic. So you may see in a case like this that one day the mother is drinking and she's really nice and lovey-dovey because she's drinking. Another day, mom is angry when she's drinking. Another day, mom is sobering up and she's nice and she feels badly that she was drinking and she's extra kind and she's doting on the child. And another day, mom is sobering up and she's really cranky. And so what you see here is that there's no predictability. Like there's no, at least you see with the anxiously attached style, one day, the parents, whenever the parents are there, they tend to be loving and warm, and then they're sometimes gone. Or at least you see with a dismissive avoidant that the parents are pretty emotionally unavailable all the time. And so the child learns to rely on themselves. A fearful avoidant, they basically learn, I don't know what to do except read into somebody's behaviors all the time. Try to read between the lines to guess. Is it going to be a day that mom's sober and nice? Can I judge her mood? How can I figure out what's going on here? And so the chaos teaches this child to not really be able to trust their environment or the people in their environment. So they become what we call hypervigilant, constantly reading between the lines, being hyper attuned to other people, their micro expressions, their body language, human behavior, all to try to derive a sense of safety in their world. And because there's this really strong disconnect of being able to trust the caregivers, the fearful avoidance is predominantly driven by the core wound and fear of being betrayed. And they also tend to have really strong fears around being unworthy, because there's this sort of inherent emotional neglect that takes place when there's chaos in a dynamic in a family. And so this child usually grows up to have core wounds around feeling afraid of abandonment, afraid of being unworthy, often feeling really bad and guilty for things. So I am bad, core wound, feeling like chronic guilt and shame very easily. They also tend to feel trapped and helpless and powerless if they feel like they have to commit too much to something, or they're being asked to sort of dive into something too deeply. They can really have those wounds come up. And they're very sensitive to feeling helpless in their world because it sort of relates back to childhood. And then on sort of the other side, they can also fear abandonment and feel afraid of being alone. And so they become the adult that's sort of like, hey, come close to me, come here, come here. And then you get close and they're like, no, stay away. I don't want to get back. And they sort of go through this ambivalence, like swinging from the anxious to avoidant side. And so this individual can be confusing, of course, to a partner in a relationship, and can be challenging in that dynamic, but also it's very challenging to be this individual with the constant like confusion and lack of being able to like settle in and feel safe and open to connection, being able to trust connection in relationships. So there's a whole lot more to say about all these different attachment styles, but I just want to introduce you, if you're new here, to sort of like the high level patterns in here when we talk about the FA or the DA or the AP and how they relate to our lives in so many different areas, because our attachment styles don't just affect us in our romantic relationships, but they also affect us in our workplace relationships and our friendships and our relationships to other family members. So if you want to check out a test, I do have a link in the description box below that has a test all about attachment styles. You can test what your attachment styles are. And there's also a great opportunity to do a deep dive into some of our 7-day free trials we have on our personal development school in terms of courses, reprogramming your attachment style, learning more about your attachment style. You can try a lot of that content out for free. So check those out in the links below. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know any other questions you might have. And thank you so much for being here and stopping by. And I look forward to seeing you in the next video.